executive privilege here. Dana's going to lead off with the first question.
Big question would be, obviously there's a number of strategies that have been presented. What's the best way to get the costs borne by the folks that are receiving the benefit?
Which one is that directed towards?
Take a whack.
Take a whack. Well, can we put some HUD policy people on that one? Yeah, right now, Matt and Karen and I all have backgrounds in architecture, and so what we've been focusing on is really how do you make this possible logistically as a construction project. And when it comes to these really complicated financing questions, there's a lot that we have to work out, particularly this urban interim housing actually falls right into a gap between FEMA's temporary housing and HUD's manufactured housing. And as you might imagine, there are a lot of kind of technicalities that are wrapped up in the problem, but I would say that there's a lot of policy work that surrounds this project that we're just tapping into, and so that's sort of phase 2 is figuring out how to do that.
From the FEMA perspective, we provide interim housing at 100% federal rate, and we provide all the funding for that in the actual housing. Within FEMA, though, we have a group called mitigation. What they do is they look at strengthening existing buildings and improving the code that would make buildings more less resistant to disasters. So it's kind of a double-edged sword. You want to prevent the buildings being susceptible to disasters. At the same time, there's always going to be some buildings that will be susceptible to disasters, and that the federal government would come in. I think the key thing there is that it's a partnership, and we've started doing that with the state-led housing task force, that the local and the federal agencies get together and work on a way to make sure that the investment that does occur is in the best interest of that community, moving that community back towards its recovery, and not something that's just a stopgap measure. It's something that's going to take them down that road.
Please provide some more specifics in terms of delivery of those FEMA units and cost in terms of range and costs. And I think it also maybe would help the audience. I've had some experience in response and recovery to define your terms. You use terms like all hazards, you use terms, it was helpful to have the time frame of weeks, months, years in terms of what you're talking about. But I'd like to get into specifics in terms of delivery times of these units. That some of them look pretty sophisticated, and a range of delivery times and costs, and maybe someone else can address this whole sort of defining of terms of temporary housing in terms of time frames. So there are a couple of questions there.
Yeah.
I'd like to start with the FEMA program. Thanks.
Sure. Thank you. We have several units up there that have various costs. They range from anything as cheap as roughly around the $30,000 price range for the unit price itself, not including installation, transportation, and all that surrounding costs. That go up as much as $80,000 per unit, no installation costs. I don't want to get into the specifics of what each item would cost, but they have a range of costs. And some of the more costly units offer other advantages that the other ones don't offer. They may be more green in the sense that their building materials are more sustainable. So it really comes down to a benefit cost analysis of what are we looking to gain in terms of what we're going to get out of the unit versus what the cost is, and we have to find that right touch point. The timeliness of installing these things also ranges. Some of the units, the stackable units, which are containerized, they're using existing containers. So it's really just modifying that existing container, whereas other materials or other units are produced from raw materials, like a manufactured home or have you. Some are SIP panels, so they have the panels that are sitting in a warehouse, and you just you basically play a assembly person with the panels on the site. So again, they also vary in cost. I hope that addresses your question. There's no, I can't really go through laundry list and give you identified, production time and cost. Does that meet what you're looking for? Mm-hmm.
So there's a period of time where they're out there in the raw, and then there's a delivery time to procure these units, and unless they're sitting somewhere, and you're talking about that aspect of it.
Right.
So it's a complicated set of questions here, but I'm trying to get some sense of how long and what's the delivery stream, and what are people doing in the interim, because they're living their lives every day, and
I got you. We have several programs that occur after a disaster. Mass Care, which is a public assistance function, offers a reimbursement to state, voluntary agency, and religious organizations who conduct shelters. We reimburse them for the cost of operating those facilities through the city, local, state. We also have what is known as the Transitional Shelter Assistance, TSA. Not can be confused with the folks at the airport. And that is where we pay hotels to house disaster survivors, and that is the other interim gap that takes, or the immediate sheltering need. And the idea is that in that 6-week period, it gives the responders, the recovery people, time to get units in place. FEMA currently has 4,000 units in inventory, in storage, in 2 locations that we could dispatch immediately. We have multiple contracts to produce the traditional forms of housing at about 150 manufacturers. So it really comes down to how fast we can install those units, whether we have viable locations to install those locations. And then, the idea is that those two would come together. The issue where it gets difficult is in a catastrophic disaster, and that that's one of our ongoing challenges. How do you handle a disaster where there is catastrophic, 500,000 people, if you will, and housing those people temporarily in shelter, and then the longer term in housing? How do you bring that housing into place? Those are the challenges that we're still working through. We have, there's no single solution to that. There are multiple ways of how you would address those populations. Certain populations can be handled best in certain strategies and like that. So in a catastrophic disaster, it's kind of a little different than a hurricane.
I'm going to jump in with a question, actually, if you folks don't mind. You both mentioned in your presentations there's a ongoing sort of sustainability element and a green element, if you will, in the units. And so I guess my question is, do you find when asking for these specifications, is there a steep learning curve for manufacturers? And then also on, obviously the folks from New York City seem to really be embracing this as well. Is there some thought once you would have these sustainable units? You mentioned in your presentation about the actual siting of the units. Does sustainability, is that a factor also in those siting considerations for the units? So I guess I have 2 questions. So.
Yeah, I would say absolutely. And part of that is keeping operating costs low, and if you can do smart passive ventilation and basic design strategies like that mean that you use less energy to heat or cool these units, then that's absolutely where we want to be. And then also when we're talking about really trying to leverage market capacity, I think the modular housing and any sort of housing provider that does this on a daily basis is moving towards sustainable systems. And so that's an emerging market trend that we hope to encourage and to take advantage of.
And I think that the aspects like the low-flow toilets or solar power, those are done so that these units can exist off the grid, not sustainability for sustainability's sake, but to make them practical solutions. So I think that it ties in a lot that way, and just making these units more practical as temporary housing options.
Yeah, I would agree with that. A lot of things we look at are challenges that we face in the post-disaster environment. Again, power grid is an issue. Water system, that tends to be another issue that we run into. So getting those, when I say water system, sewer system, so those sustainable options can also help us in getting temporary housing back into the community where we would normally have to wait for those services to come up to par for reoccupying that area. That gives us an option to move in sooner rather than later. The question is the cost benefit analysis that we need to do. These sustainable options, construction methods sometimes cost a little bit more, and we have to remember what our true mission at hand is to provide temporary housing. So again, there's no single way to saying that we're going to go green all the time. You have to look at it and evaluate it.
I was intrigued that both FEMA and New York touched on, at least, the development of temporary to permanent housing. And I'd be interested in you discussing some of the factors that are pushing you in the somewhat non-traditional approach to looking at providing temporary to permanent. And what are the problems that you haven't solved yet as you would look at making that movement from temporary to permanent?
Do you want to start?
Well, one question that we have is who's going to own these housing units, and so that's really kind of the question of what happens to them after they're used immediately post-disaster. One thing that we're doing is sort of expanding the definition of temporary beyond the 18 months that's right now specified by FEMA, because we expect that it would take actually a lot longer than that to rebuild the city and to replenish sufficient permanent housing stock. And also we want these units to be high quality, safe places for people to live. And so they do meet our New York City 2008 construction codes with a couple of exceptions. But I would say that with the performance specification, we're really saying we want housing that's very similar in a lot of ways to permanent housing, and is it more cost effective in certain situations to be able to rapidly deploy housing that can be ultimately permanent, and whether that means that we partner with a nonprofit developer in certain cases, or sell units cheaply to individuals. It could go a variety of ways, and Joel maybe can talk more about that.
As you know, that we have the alternative pilot program. They've spoken at these sessions before, and they really started doing the temp to perm situation. We learned after Katrina and actually other disasters that the housing stock following disaster for the various socioeconomic segments do not always come back online as fast as we would like. Again, as Cynthia pointed out, FEMA's statutory program is 18 months. We face with the reality, though, that sometimes housing does not come back in 18 months. Depending on how bad the disaster is, the economic climate of the situation. Obviously, if we had a disaster now, obviously the economic climate of the current day would obviously have some impact on it. The wealth of the community in that area also has an impact on it. So we've kind of come to realization, because we still have folks in temporary housing in the Gulf Coast area from Katrina Rita, that may not be we cannot always meet the 18 months. There is no garden variety disaster, but if there was one, 18 months may be doable. For example, if you look at Greensburg, Kansas, where that community was very devastated by a tornado, 18 months was more than enough for them to get a majority of their housing online, either through building on their own or moving out to other communities or whatever have you. So that was sufficient. But again, that's a different type of disaster than a Katrina Rita disaster. So we're facing the reality of housing stock not being brought up to be repaired after disaster, and realizing that. And that also comes out as you might be aware of, is the Disaster Housing Assistance Program, which is a cooperation with HUD and FEMA to provide vouchers to folks to find housing who may not have the income post-disaster to find the appropriate housing for themselves. So there's also that aspect of it too. So there's the job aspect. I can't find a house unless I have a job, and that stuff too.
Thanks. A couple of presentations mentioned, obviously the challenges of complying with the current codes and standards. I'm curious, aside from, I know you mentioned obviously accessibility, especially with the stackable units, but are there any other challenges that you've run into, like maybe from a fire safety code standpoint or structural, or areas like that? I'd be interested in hearing about any experiences along those lines.
I can talk a little bit about this. We have, right now in our current inventory, we have 3 basic types of units. We have the travel trailer, which is constructed to the NFPA 1192 standard. We have the park model, which is constructed to the ANSI 119.5 standard. And of course, we have the HUD manufactured home, which is constructed to the HUD 3280 code. We also have some homes up here I mentioned that were constructed to the IRC. The ones we have going out to our laboratory are, I believe, one is constructed to the IBC code, if I'm not mistaken. I'm checking my resource here. So we have various codes. One thing we are realizing within our own organization is that the progress of codes is set at different paces. So you have IRC, the International Code Councils are set at one pace, whereas HUD may be set at a different pace, and that's for different reasons. The HUD manufactured home code is influenced by the manufacturers, which want to slow down the development of code for their benefit, because their segment that they reach to is important. So does that answer your question?
Looks like I have a follow-up question.
Yeah. Well, actually, I'm active in the IRC and IBC code arena, so of course I'm familiar with the codes. But I know that actually I represent NAHB. I'm the program manager for structural codes and standards, and so I'm aware that within the codes, even for permanent housing, I know there are particular areas of the code that present challenges to a builder just trying to do regular housing, and would probably present even more challenges trying to do a very cheap, very easy to construct, very quick to construct interim solution. And so kind of within that I was wondering what challenges actually working with one of the codes that some of the programs may have encountered.
Yeah, I would say that one example that we've had on that topic is fire safety. And we initially said that we want to have 2-hour ratings for our construction, and we want it to be non-combustible. But in order to leverage as many manufacturers as we can, the capability to build non-combustible units is not something that everybody has. And so we've been trying to address that with our Department of Buildings and our fire department, looking at, can we actually do sprinkler systems in the units, and actually many manufacturers have that capability. And so right now, actually, we're in the process of deciding what the actual specifications in relationship to fire safety in our performance spec will be. But I would say that there are a lot of tricky, things like that.
One of the things that we discovered with the alternative housing pilot program was, as long as you stay within the boundaries, it's just an engineering problem. If you said I want to build to 900-mile-an-hour wind speeds, then it stops being an engineering problem and starts to become space, rocket science or something like that. So and in the quantities we're talking about, all of these folks can pretty much get what we ask for. If you want, if you go to Ford and want to buy one Taurus, you're going to get a Taurus. If you want to buy a Taurus with fins like the 1959 Cadillac, and you're willing to buy 40,000 Tauruses, you're going to get fins like the 1959 Cadillac. You see, so the market has a lot of control, and the alternative housing pilot program is designed to best the IRC. There have more wind resistance, just a number of additional performance elements. We're working with FEMA now to maybe craft a body of specifications, not code, that would raise the bar. Would make multiple, would cross multiple flavors of units. So we could, thus say, it doesn't matter whether you get a small unit, a medium-sized unit, or a big unit. You're going to get a unit that protects your family at the same level and performs the same way. So, and the manufacturers have frequently been, they're willing to engage in those discussions, as long as the quantities are high enough. If you go, when you're building one of them, it doesn't work. But when you're building hundreds or thousands, it becomes pretty much a fairly straightforward process. I don't want to diminish the fact that the manufacturers have this angst about us changing the way they're doing business, but at sufficient quantities, we can, they'll deliver just about whatever we ask for, as long as we don't get
unreasonable.
Unreasonable, I guess, is a good. Crazy may be a better term.
Time for one last question.
Just curious about the homes that the prototypes that you're looking at. Okay. When I was out in the field after Hurricane Katrina, there were several families that had very large families, and we had to put some of the families into trailers. So are you looking at some prototypes that can accommodate large families?
You want to start first?
Sure. For New York City, we are, and part of our specification is, 1-bedroom units scaling up to 3-bedroom units, and then so 3-bedroom is our biggest unit, and then since these are really multifamily, multi-story units, it could be effectively there's some flexibility there as far as what you could even open up for connecting these units or having people sort of on the same hallway next door to each other.
Part of the issue might have been is that footprint of the person's place where they're going into. We had to meet the floodplain requirements. We had to meet the size lot they had, and so we could put 2 travel trailers in there versus one manufactured home, which had a nice 3-bedroom. One of the things that we've been looking at with the alternative housing is buildings that have configurable design. So if you need 1-bedroom, you can get a 1-bedroom there. If you need 2 bedrooms, as Cynthia mentioned, you put 2 units together, and you can shift them around to meet the footprint of that private site. If you're going to a private site, that was usually most of the problems we ran into was either floodplain or footprint that we were forced to go into. That's what kind of hampered us in terms of the putting a large family into two smaller units. Typically, we have a policy that we put folks into the appropriate size unit. Obviously, the household may have just chosen to stay at home and have 2 small units, then going across town to a group site with a larger unit. So they make that decision themselves. We give them the option. These are the 2 options. Obviously, when a disaster occurs, there's always these circumstances that you run into that prescribe how you will execute it, and that affects it.
Yeah, so I think it's something that makes this such an interesting field is that it takes something like what you're talking about, where really the nuclear family is not what we're looking at, always in housing, and sustainability issues and cost issues and speed issues, and just makes them much more urgent so that we can think about all those things all at once, and then think about how they can actually permeate out into issues beyond just post-disaster situations.
So with that, we'll wrap up our program. I'd like to thank everyone for coming, and let's have a round of applause for our speakers.